In this lecture, we'll implement the constructor for a standard six-sided die, and in the next lecture, we'll implement a more general constructor that lets a consumer of the class specify how many sides the die will have. Although you can include constructors in your UML class diagrams, I tend to personally not do that, so let's go right to the code. Remember, our die class already has fields and properties. I'm going to add another region, and we know we're going to eventually have two constructors, so I'll call it constructors. Just as we made our properties public so consumers of the class could access those properties, we'll make our constructor public as well because we want consumers of the class to be able to call the constructor to create a new die object. The name of a constructor is always the name of the class. So I have to call my constructor die exactly this way with the same capitalization and everything. And then I put open and close parentheses, whether or not the constructor has parameters. We'll see in the next lecture a constructor that does have parameters, but this constructor doesn't. And I'll add a documentation comment. Constructor for six-sided die. Now, you may not believe that a six-sided die is a standard die. You may think a D20 is the appropriate standard die, but most people, if you ask them about a die, they'll say it has six sides. So we'll make this constructor build a six-sided die, and in the following lecture, we'll add another constructor that lets the consumer of the class specify how many sides the die should have. Within our constructor, we need to initialize the state of our object and do any other work that we need to do, which doesn't apply in this particular case, to get our object ready to use. So a consumer of the class should assume, after they've called the constructor to create a new object, that object is ready to use. There shouldn't be anything else they have to do before they start using that object. That initialization is really easy here in our constructor. All we need to do is assign values to the numSides and topside fields. NumSides get set to 6 because we're constructing a six-sided die. And for topside, it really doesn't matter what we put here. This is like you just take a die and you place it on the table. At that point, it doesn't matter which number is on top. Somebody is going to roll the die before they actually use the top side in their game. So this is just creating the die object and conceptually setting it on the table. You will notice that even though we're programmers, we're not setting top side to 0 here. We'll actually number the sides of our die 1 through 6 rather than 0 through 5. Because dice are for humans to use, and even in a game that uses our die object, even if it's running on a computer, the dice should be labeled with faces starting with 1, not with 0. Now that we've built a constructor, we can actually test our code, both testing the constructor and testing the properties we wrote in the previous lecture. I've already added the code to do that testing. At the beginning, I've declared a new variable called standard die, and we've declared variables that are reference types before, that are objects. So we put the name of the class, which is the class we've been working on, and the name of the variable. And we know that for reference types, it's required that we create the new object before we actually start using it. So I'm calling the constructor that we just wrote using the new keyword, just like we always have done to create new objects in Console Apps. I've added a header that says the information that follows is for the standard die because in the next lecture I'll be writing a constructor for the D20 die, and I want to separate the information I'm printing out for those two dice. And finally, I print out the number of sides for the die by accessing the numSides property for my standard die object, and then I print the top side by accessing the topside property for our standard die object. When I run my code, the results we get are exactly as expected. The number of sides is 6 because we set the numSides field to 6 in our constructor, and our numSides property retrieves the value of that variable or field and returns it to the consumer of the class. And topside is 1, also as we expected, based on the fact that we initialized our topside field to 1 in the constructor we just wrote. And that's all we needed to do to write our first constructor for our die class. To recap, in this lecture you learned how to implement a constructor, and you also learned that access modifiers apply to constructors.